Opening the queen and bishop, this pawn thrust immediately claims central territory and prepares for active piece development, setting a dynamic tone from the outset. French defense, a solid choice, immediately aiming to contest the center and prepare for a robust pawn structure, often leading to complex closed positions. Immediately claiming central space, white signals an intention to control the game's core, pushing black into a defensive posture. Initiating the central pawn struggle defines black's strategy, challenging white's early dominion. A subtle pawn commitment, preparing to support the center without blocking the bishop's diagonal. Challenging the center immediately, black seeks to disrupt white's pawn structure and seize central space. Developing the knight to f3 now aims to control the center and prepare for kingside castling, keeping the pawn structure flexible. Solidifying the center and preparing for pawn liberation, this knight boldly ventures into the fray. Opening the center now forces black to immediately resolve the tension, impacting piece development and pawn structure. Reclaiming the center with the pawn immediately resolves central tension, setting the stage for piece development. Developing the bishop here pins the knight, creating immediate pressure and potentially disrupting black's pawn structure. Solidifying central presence, black prepares to activate the kingside, eyeing potential queenside play. Embracing tactical liberation, white clears the central tension and aims for a more open game, forcing black to consider piece development. Reclaiming the pawn efficiently secures black's central presence and unblocks the bishop's diagonal influence. Securing the king's safety is paramount, clearing the way for active piece development. Developing the knight to e7 is a flexible approach, preparing to contest the center and potentially support a queenside expansion. Shifting the knight to its new outpost aims to control the d4 square and potentially pressure black's queenside. Re-establishing the bishop's presence in the center solidifies black's central control and prepares for potential counterplay. Exchanging that bishop strategically opens up diagonals for your queen and weakens black's pawn structure around their monarch. Opening the b-file for your rook provides active counterplay against white's central pawns. Targeting weaknesses in black's pawn structure, this queen sortie aims to exploit the isolated d5 pawn and create immediate attacking potential. Securing the monarch is paramount, a prudent step against white's central pressure and the lingering bishop threat. Developing the bishop to f4 aims to control the central dark squares and prepare for potential kingside pressure, creating a more dynamic piece structure. Initiating an aggressive pawn storm on the kingside, this knight repositioning aims to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially create immediate threats. Chasing the knight away forces black to reinforce its central pawn structure and concedes the initiative. Asserting queen presence on the queenside, this move simultaneously defends the d5 pawn and eyes potential weaknesses on white's queenside. Trading off black's active bishop fundamentally alters the pawn structure, creating permanent weaknesses around the king for white to exploit. Recapturing the knight opens lines for your queen and bishop, eyeing weaknesses in white's pawn structure. Centering the knight on e5 pressures black's pawn structure while preparing for pawn breakthroughs. Reclaiming central influence with that knight, black aims to disrupt white's bishop pair advantage. Liberating the knight to pressure the d6 pawn offers a tactical shot, potentially disrupting black's pawn structure. This pawn structure presents a dynamic challenge, forcing black to carefully consider the long-term consequences of the doubled pawns versus white's active pieces. Unleashing the knight to harass the queen and disrupt black's queenside structure. A daring foray into enemy territory, seeking immediate material gain at the cost of king's safety. Recapturing the knight maintains pressure and central control, aiming to exploit the weakened queen's pawn. Clearing the center with this exchange simplifies the position, initiating a pawn structure shift and initiating the endgame transition. Simplifying the game, white aims to exploit the isolated d-pawn and create threats against black's weakened king structure as the queen's exit. Reclaiming the bishop on a6 initiates a counterthrust, aiming to disrupt white's central control and exploit any awkward piece placement. Reclaiming the open central file after the rook exchange sets up the potential for aggressive central pawn pushes. Re-establishing the central pawn presence while reinforcing the e-file's tactical potential. Clearing the central files, this exchange simplifies the position, preparing for an endgame where piece activity will be paramount. Liberating the rook from its defensive duties on the e-file now allows it to seek active posting on the now-open central files. Challenging black's isolated pawn opens critical lines for white's rooks. A strategic retreat, placing the bishop on a broad diagonal, eyeing white's queenside pawn structure and preparing for a potential queenside initiative. Unleashing a knight with aggressive intent, seeking to exploit black's compromised pawn structure for material gain. A bold material grab that sacrifices piece coordination for a pawn. Watch out for counterplay on the open files. Reclaiming the knight on a5, this move aims to liberate the white queen and apply pressure on the queenside pawns. Solidifying the pawn structure, preparing to challenge white's isolated knight's future positional advantage and potentially activate the weakened queenside. Reasserting piece activity, this knight now eyes the weak c3 square and supports the central pawn advance. Actively contesting the d-file with the bishop, aiming to disrupt white's coordinated pieces. Asserting pressure on the b-file, this repositioning seeks to exploit the isolated pawn and create future attacking possibilities. Recapturing that pawn opens up the queenside, but allows white to consolidate their attack on the kingside with the rook now active. Reclaiming a pawn while simultaneously opening a powerful diagonal for the bishop aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and exploit the resulting weaknesses. Finally, the rook regains activity, eyeing the pawn outpost with fresh purpose. A bold check, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially weaken the king's defenses. Securing the monarch amidst potential tactical storm signals cautious regrouping. Initiating pawn structure expansion, this attempt seeks to pry open the kingside and initiate an attack. Suddenly, a desperado pawn sacrifice aims to disrupt white's passed pawn advance and create counterplay. Unveiling a decisive fork on the king, this tempo gain forces material recapture. Relocating the king to safety on this square prepares for potential pawn advances, a crucial step in the endgame. Securing the central pawn advance, this move aims to consolidate white's queenside initiative and disrupt black's piece coordination. Reclaiming the pawn on c4 simplifies the position and prepares for a more active rook endgame. Unleashing a powerful rook check to disrupt black's defensive structure and force a retreat, aiming to regain material advantage. The king abandons the relative safety of the corner, seeking open terrain but exposing itself to the battery on the b-file. This redeployment prepares to reclaim the sacrificed knight, aiming to unravel black's overextended pawn structure. Reclaiming the active square for the rook, this play aims to disrupt white's pawn structure and coordinate its pieces more effectively in the unfolding endgame. Unpinning the knight opens a critical diagonal for the bishop, preparing to regain lost material. Targeting the advanced pawn, this captures material but opens up the white knight to attack the king further. The knight's daring dive threatens to cripple black's pawn structure on the queenside. Reconnecting the knight to the central conflict, preparing to pressure white's isolated pawn. Pioneering a pawn thrust to potentially free the bishop and advance it forward. A desperate check, hoping to disrupt white's pawn structure and gain time before the inevitable material loss. Securing the king's sanctuary amidst the encroaching shadows is paramount now, before the enemy cavalry closes in. Chasing that knight into a mating net reveals your king's precarious position, a tactical blunder that costs material. A desperate king scramble, abandoning queenside control for immediate survival against the rampant knight. Redirecting the rook to the king's side promises a counterattack against the exposed monarch. Securing the king's escape path is paramount as the action intensifies across the board. Capturing the pawn opens a dangerous avenue for the rook, creating immediate tactical challenges for white's king. Asserting control over the d-file now, aiming to exploit the exposed black king. Initiating a daring pawn, storm aims to disrupt white's controlled center and potentially create counterplay. Aggressively contesting the active rook, aims to solidify the knight's outpost and prevent further infiltration by black's pieces. A desperate check, as the knight embarks on a final, albeit futile, raid against the exposed monarch. Capturing the knight neutralizes a dangerous attacking piece, simplifying the board and heading towards a more manageable endgame. Sacrificing a pawn to disrupt white's king's safety, while repositioning a piece for attack. Consolidating the king's position becomes paramount, with the looming threat of the knight on f2. Black's rook repositions, eyeing the advanced white pawn on a6. Unleashing a royal hunt across the board, seeking to shatter the king's sanctuary. The king abandons its defensive structure, venturing into active, albeit precarious, territory. Reclaiming the 7th rank offers crucial open lines and forces the black rook into a passive defensive posture. Unleashing a final king hunt across the board, this counterattack aims to disrupt white's queenside pawn structure before the inevitable endgame. Protecting your king from those persistent checks becomes paramount now. Seeking perpetual check, the black king dances to avoid the white knight's relentless pursuit. The king cautiously retreats, seeking safety behind the pawn wall as the perpetual check forces a draw. Sacrificing central control to open lines for counterplay against the exposed monarch. Clearing a path for the knight to infiltrate enemy territory. Unleashing the pawn's potential, this advance seeks to create mating threats or free up lines for the rook. Forcing the king into a vulnerable square with a tempo attack. The king retreats to safety, seeking refuge from the oncoming storm. Unleashing the knight to probe the king's immediate surroundings offers a chance to shake up the king's sanctuary. King safety plunges as the black monarch retreats into a newly formed, yet precarious, sanctuary amidst the approaching white cavalry. Consolidating the rook's influence on the 6th rank, aiming to restrict black's pawn advances. This pawn push opens lines and offers a passed pawn, but also potentially exposes the king to further threats. Snatching that pawn opens a deadly diagonal for the rook and forces the black king further into exposure. A desperate king flees into a trap. This retreat only delays the inevitable checkmate sequence. Sacrificing the pawn opens a clear diagonal for the rook to begin its aggressive sweep across the board. Bringing the king closer to the action activates it for the endgame, preparing to support pawns or contest central squares. Reclaiming the central square allows the rook to prepare for a potential advance, threatening to squeeze black's position. Seeking to reanimate the dormant light-squared bishop, black seeks to reactivate it through this rook maneuver. Seeking safe harbor, the king vacates the dangerous central files. Seeking to centralize the king for the endgame, venturing towards d5. Shifting the king towards the center offers more defensive options against potential checks.